Hunters know the rules of the wild: track quietly, shoot clean, respect the terrain, but sometimes the forest doesn't follow back. From apex predators to strange figures that don't belong, the deeper you go, the thinner the line between stalker and prey. These aren't campfire tales. They're blood-chilling accounts from those who walked in, but didn't always walk out the same. In this video, we explore 6 terrifying encounters from North America's most unforgiving hunting grounds. From a brutal bear attack in Alaska to a silent shadow in Idaho, these stories go from primal survival to pure dread. The morning of June 22, 2025 dawned crisp and clear along the Ravenstone Creek path in Seward, Alaska. The region's dense spruce forests stretched endlessly in every direction, punctuated by glacier-carved valleys and rushing streams that had carved their way through the landscape for millennia. This particular stretch of wilderness had earned a reputation among local hunters as both productive and dangerous, with brown bears and grizzlies regularly patrolling the salmon runs and berry patches that dotted the terrain. The Alaska Department had organized a public hunting seminar that weekend, drawing roughly 30 participants from across the state. The event was designed to teach wilderness survival skills and proper hunting techniques to both seasoned hunters and newcomers alike. Among the attendees were teenagers learning their first lessons in field dressing and scent control, middle-aged hunters looking to refine their techniques, and a handful of retired guides who had volunteered to share their decades of experience. The seminar's organizers had chosen a clearing approximately 2 miles from the main trailhead, where they had set up a series of demonstration stations. One station focused on proper tree stand placement, another on tracking techniques, and a third on bait station management. The latter had proven particularly popular, as many of the attendees were bear hunters preparing for the upcoming season. 20-year-old Cody Harrison had driven up from Anchorage specifically for this seminar. Harrison, an apprentice hunter with barely 2 seasons under his belt, possessed an enthusiasm that far exceeded his experience. He had volunteered eagerly when the instructors asked for someone to demonstrate proper bait barrel placement and scent application techniques. Harrison carried himself with the confidence of someone who had read every hunting manual and watched countless videos, though his actual field experience remained limited. The demonstration began smoothly enough. Harrison explained to the gathered crowd how he would position the bait barrel to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns, describing the importance of scent control and the proper application of synthetic attractants. He wore a chest holster containing a Glock 20 chambered in 10 mm, a standard bear defense weapon that most Alaskan hunters carried. However, Harrison had left the holster unsnapped for ease of movement during the demonstration, a decision that would prove fateful. As Harrison finished explaining the proper distance between bait stations, he produced a bottle of synthetic moose attractant. The liquid had been designed to mimic the scent of a cow moose in estrus, and Harrison began spraying it liberally around the demonstration area. The sharp, musky odor carried easily on the light breeze, and several attendees commented on its potency. What none of them realized was that a massive male grizzly bear had been tracking various scent trails throughout the morning. The bear, later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh over 700 pounds, had been following the complex web of human scents, food odors, and now the concentrated attractant that Harrison had just released into the air. The attack happened with terrifying speed. Later reconstructions based on cell phone footage and witness statements indicated that the grizzly charged from the tree line approximately 70 yards away, covering the distance in under 6 seconds. The first person to spot the bear was retired guide Alan Densby, who shouted a warning that sent the entire crowd scrambling for cover. Harrison attempted to draw his sidearm as he turned toward the approaching threat, but his feet slipped on a patch of wet leaves that had accumulated near the demonstration area. The combination of his sudden movement and the unsecured holster caused him to fumble the weapon, and it fell uselessly to the ground as the massive bear closed the final yards between them. The mauling was swift and brutal. Several attendees, including Densby, attempted to fire warning shots into the air, but their efforts came too late to save Harrison. The grizzly's attack was ferocious and decisive, leaving no doubt about the outcome. The bear remained over Harrison's body for several minutes, despite the continued noise and commotion from the horrified witnesses. Eventually, sustained gunfire from multiple hunters drove the Grizzly back into the tree line, but Harrison was already beyond help. Emergency responders arrived within 40 minutes, but they could only confirm what everyone already knew. The young hunter's death sent shockwaves through Alaska's tight-knit hunting community, where such incidents, while always a risk, remained relatively rare. The hunting seminar organizers never held another public event in that location. Within months, they had erected a wooden plaque near the demonstration area, warning future generations about the unpredictable nature of Alaska's wilderness. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Cody Harrison, respect the wild." Harrison's death became a cautionary tale told in hunting lodges and sporting goods stores throughout Alaska. Veterans would remind newcomers that confidence without experience could prove deadly, and that the wilderness demanded respect above all else. The incident also led to changes in seminar protocols, with organizers requiring all demonstration participants to keep their weapons secured and ready, and limiting the use of attractants in areas with high bear activity. The Ravenstone Creek path continued to attract hunters and hikers, but that particular clearing remained largely avoided, marked by the weathered plaque and the collective memory of those who witnessed Alaska's wilderness claim another victim. The Bitter Pine Wilderness Reserve stretched across western Montana like a vast wilderness cathedral, its peaks and valleys carved by millennia of glacial activity and weather. In November 2009, the region had already received its first significant snowfall of the season, with over a foot of powder blanketing the higher elevations. The area had a complex history with predator populations, particularly after the controversial wolf reintroduction program of the 1990s had restored gray wolves to their traditional hunting grounds. Rick McAllister, a 41-year-old bow hunter from Missoula, had been planning this late-season elk hunt for months. McAllister possessed over 15 years of archery experience and carried a Hoyt carbon matrix compound bow, a weapon he had spent countless hours perfecting his accuracy with at ranges up to 60 yards. His gear included a GPS unit, snow gaiters, and enough provisions for a 3-day backcountry hunt. The morning of November 18th found McAllister following a promising set of elk tracks through terrain that had been dramatically altered by the 2007 wildfire season. Blackened pine skeletons stood like sentinels against the white landscape, their charred remains creating an eerie backdrop for his pursuit. The tracks he followed belonged to what appeared to be a mature bull elk, judging by the size and spacing of the hoofprints in the snow. McAllister had been tracking for roughly 3 hours when the elk trail led him into a steep-sided ravine that cut through the burned forest. The gorge was perhaps 40 yards wide at its mouth, but narrowed considerably as it wound deeper into the hillside. Snow had drifted heavily in the protected areas, creating deep pockets that made movement difficult and treacherous. The veteran hunter began to notice changes in the tracking conditions as he progressed deeper into the ravine. The elk prints became less distinct, eventually disappearing entirely into a windswept section where the snow had been scoured down to bare rock. What replaced them was far more concerning, overlapping paw prints that crisscrossed his own boot tracks in the snow. McAllister's years of experience had taught him to recognize the signs of predator activity, and these tracks belonged unmistakably to wolves. The prints were large, indicating mature adults, and their pattern suggested deliberate movement rather than random wandering. More troubling was the realization that the tracks were fresh, likely made within the past hour. The attack never came in the traditional sense, but what followed was perhaps more unnerving. McAllister found himself systematically cut off from escape routes by what he later estimated to be a pack of at least 6 wolves. 3 of the animals positioned themselves near the ravine's entrance, effectively blocking his most direct route back to familiar territory. The others had somehow maneuvered to higher ground, occupying positions that would allow them to intercept any attempt to climb out of the gorge. The wolves' tactics displayed a level of coordination that left McAllister genuinely impressed despite his predicament. They maintained their positions without revealing themselves completely, allowing him only glimpses of movement in the burned timber and occasional flashes of gray fur against the snow. The silence was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the encounter, broken only by the occasional crack of settling snow or the distant call of a raven. McAllister drew an arrow and nocked it, though he understood the futility of the gesture. Even his most accurate shots would be insufficient against multiple attackers, and wounding one animal would likely trigger an aggressive response from the entire pack. Instead, he climbed onto a large boulder that provided some elevation and began making noise, hoping to discourage the wolves through intimidation rather than violence. The standoff continued for roughly 30 minutes, during which McAllister fired several arrows harmlessly into the air while shouting and banging his bow against the rock. The wolves maintained their positions throughout his display, occasionally moving to different vantage points but never approaching closer than 30 yards. Eventually, the pack simply melted away into the burned forest as quietly as they had appeared. McAllister waited another hour before attempting to leave the ravine, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. His exit from the gorge was accomplished without incident, though he discovered additional wolf tracks along his route that suggested the animals had continued monitoring his movements. The experience left McAllister badly shaken and questioning his continued participation in backcountry hunting. He completed the hike back to his vehicle as darkness fell, his hands still trembling from a combination of cold and adrenaline. The following spring, he sold his Hoyt carbon matrix bow and never returned to hunt the Bitter Pine Wilderness Reserve. The Cascade Timberland Preserve contains within its boundaries some of the most historically significant terrain in the Pacific Northwest. Among its hidden treasures lay forgotten stretches of a treacherous but vital segment of a trail that had carried thousands of pioneers around the southern slopes of Mount Hood during the mid-1800s. By October 1996, most traces of the original wagon route had been reclaimed by dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, though careful observers could still identify remnants of the old roadbed. Deborah Langford, a 33-year-old former Marine turned solo deer hunter, had specifically chosen this remote location for her annual hunting trip. Langford possessed both the military training and wilderness experience necessary to hunt alone in challenging terrain, armed with a Remington 700 bolt-action rifle chambered in .308 Winchester. Her bivouac camp was established in a small clearing that had once served as a rest stop for exhausted wagon trains, though few modern visitors would recognize its historical significance. The first night passed without incident, though Langford noted the unusual silence that seemed to pervade the forest. Even the typical sounds of nocturnal wildlife appeared muted, creating an atmosphere that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. She had chosen this location partly for its isolation, but the complete absence of other hunters in the area was beginning to feel less like solitude and more like abandonment. By the second morning, Langford began noticing small disturbances around her campsite that seemed inconsistent with normal wildlife activity. Several items had been moved during the night, including a pair of wool socks that had been drying on a makeshift clothesline. The socks were found roughly 20 yards from camp, bearing what appeared to be puncture marks from large canine teeth. More troubling was the discovery of deep scratches on the lid of her food cooler, gouges that suggested claws rather than random damage. The third evening brought a more obvious sign of unwanted attention. Langford discovered a series of large, rounded paw prints in the soft earth near her tent, prints that measured roughly 4 inches across with no visible claw marks. Her military training had included basic tracking skills, and she recognized the distinctive characteristics of mountain lion tracks. The prints formed a rough circle around her campsite, suggesting the animal had spent considerable time observing her activities. Langford decided to climb into her portable tree stand well before dawn on the fourth day, hoping to gain a tactical advantage over whatever had been visiting her camp. The stand was positioned 15 feet above ground level in a sturdy Douglas fir, providing excellent visibility across the small clearing while keeping her safely out of reach of ground-based predators. Her patience was rewarded shortly after sunrise when a mature mountain lion emerged from the tree line directly across from her position. The animal was magnificent in its power and grace, easily weighing over 100 pounds with the distinctive tawny coat and muscular build of a male cougar. What made the encounter particularly unnerving was the cat's behavior. Rather than passing through the area or investigating the abandoned campsite, it positioned itself in clear view and began what could only be described as a staring contest. The cougar remained visible for the entire morning, occasionally shifting positions but never breaking visual contact with Langford's tree stand. Its behavior suggested a level of intelligence and patience that left the former Marine genuinely concerned for her safety. The animal seemed to understand that she was trapped in the tree and appeared content to wait for her to make a mistake. As the day progressed, Langford found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Her water supply was limited and the October weather was turning colder as clouds moved in from the west. The cougar showed no signs of losing interest, occasionally stretching or grooming itself while maintaining its vigil. Several times throughout the afternoon, the animal would disappear into the forest only to reappear an hour later in a different location, always maintaining visual contact with the tree stand. The situation became critical as darkness approached. Langford understood that descending from the tree at night would be tantamount to suicide, but remaining in the stand through a cold October night posed its own risks. She had not dressed for extended exposure, and hypothermia was a real possibility if temperatures dropped significantly. The cougar's behavior changed subtly as evening approached. Rather than maintaining its stationary watch, it began moving in a slow circle around the base of the tree, occasionally pausing to look upward. The animal's patience and tactical awareness were becoming increasingly apparent, and Langford began to appreciate the gravity of her situation. She remained in the tree stand for 19 hours total, enduring freezing rain that began around midnight and continued until dawn. The cougar disappeared sometime during the night, though whether it had genuinely left or simply moved beyond her limited field of vision remained unclear. When she finally descended at first light, Langford discovered fresh paw prints completely encircling the tree, evidence that her stalker had remained active throughout the night. The former Marine broke camp with unusual haste, abandoning several pieces of equipment in her eagerness to leave the area. She later documented the experience in a blog post titled, "A Marine Can Be Prey Too," which became required reading at several survival training programs. Langford never returned to hunt the Cascade Timberland Preserve, though she continued hunting in other locations for several more years. The northern reaches of the Yukon Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of tundra that had remained virtually unchanged since the last ice age. The region was experiencing an early freeze in September 1982 that had transformed the landscape into a crystalline wilderness of permafrost and wind-carved snowdrifts. The area around the Porcupine River had long been favored by hunters seeking trophy moose, though the remoteness of the location demanded both exceptional preparation and considerable experience. 59-year-old Marcus Thompson had been planning this hunting expedition for over a year, viewing it as potentially his final major wilderness adventure. Thompson had convinced his nephew David to accompany him on what they had dubbed their last big trip, a 3-week journey into some of the most isolated hunting territory in North America. The uncle-nephew team had successfully harvested a magnificent bull moose on their second day, a specimen that would have satisfied most hunters and ended their expedition. However, Thompson's decades of hunting experience had taught him to recognize exceptional opportunities when they presented themselves. On the morning of September 23rd, he spotted what appeared to be an even larger bull moose across a side valley that branched off from their main hunting area. The animal was easily a mile away, but its massive antlers were visible even at that distance, suggesting a truly exceptional trophy. The decision to pursue the distant moose proved to be the beginning of Thompson's ordeal. The hunting partners had divided their equipment in a manner that seemed logical at the time, with David carrying their recently acquired GPS prototype unit, while Thompson carried his trusted .303 Enfield rifle. The weapon had served Thompson well for over 30 years, though the recent successful hunt had left him with only a single cartridge remaining. The terrain that separated Thompson from his quarry was deceptively challenging. What appeared from a distance to be relatively flat tundra was actually a complex series of gentle rises and subtle depressions that created a maze-like landscape. The early snow had obscured many of the natural landmarks that might have aided navigation, creating a uniform white expanse that offered few reference points. Thompson became separated from his nephew when he decided to pursue a different route around what appeared to be a frozen pond. The separation was initially viewed as temporary, with both men expecting to reunite within a few hours. However, the flat terrain and uniform snow cover made it virtually impossible to maintain visual contact, and the bitter wind made voice communication ineffective beyond a few dozen yards. As the hours passed, Thompson began to realize the severity of his situation. The GPS unit remained with David, leaving the older hunter with only his basic compass and decades of wilderness experience to guide him. The problem was compounded by the fact that the tundra landscape offered few distinctive features that could serve as navigation aids. Every direction looked essentially identical, creating a disorienting effect that challenged even experienced outdoorsmen. The first night alone was manageable, though Thompson recognized that his situation was becoming critical. His emergency supplies were limited, and the dropping temperatures posed a serious threat to his survival. He had constructed a basic shelter using his emergency bivvy and managed to stay reasonably warm, though sleep was fitful and interrupted by the constant wind. By the second day, Thompson was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia and dehydration. His decision-making abilities were becoming compromised, and he began experiencing what appeared to be mild hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and exposure. The most persistent of these visions was a figure in a yellow parka that appeared to be watching him from distant ridgelines. The figure seemed to appear most frequently during the evening hours, always maintaining a considerable distance but remaining visible for extended periods. Thompson initially dismissed these sightings as products of his deteriorating mental state, but the consistency of the apparition began to trouble him. The figure appeared to be wearing hunting gear, including what looked like a distinctive set of antlers attached to the parka hood. What made these sightings particularly unsettling was the figure's behavior. Rather than moving naturally across the landscape, it seemed to simply appear and disappear at will, always maintaining the same distant position regardless of Thompson's attempts to approach or avoid it. Most disturbing of all was the figure's apparent lack of normal human responses. It never waved, never attempted communication, and never seemed to blink during their extended staring contests. On his third day alone, Thompson made the decision to fire his remaining cartridge into the air as a signal for help. The single rifle shot echoed across the empty tundra but produced no immediate response. Thompson collapsed shortly after firing the shot, his energy reserves finally exhausted by the combination of cold, hunger, and dehydration. The rescue came just as Thompson was beginning to lose consciousness. A bush pilot hired by David had been conducting search patterns across the area and spotted the fallen hunter from the air. The pilot managed to land his small aircraft on a relatively flat section of tundra and provided immediate medical attention before transporting Thompson to the nearest medical facility. Thompson's recovery was complicated by severe frostbite that ultimately required the amputation of 2 toes. The physical recovery was eventually complete, but the psychological impact of the experience proved more lasting. Thompson never hunted again, though he continued to tell anyone who would listen about the figure in the yellow parka with antlers. Years later, Thompson remained convinced that what he had seen was not a hallucination brought on by exposure and dehydration. He insisted that the figure had been real, and that its behavior had been far too consistent and purposeful to be dismissed as a product of his deteriorating mental state. The details he provided remained remarkably consistent across multiple tellings, and he often pointed out that even in his compromised state, he had been able to accurately navigate and make other rational decisions. Most unsettling of all was his persistent claim that during all their encounters, the figure had never once blinked. The Elkmire Highlands Preserve straddles the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, containing some of the most biodiverse temperate forests in North America. The region's black bear population had recovered dramatically since the 1940s, when hunting pressure and habitat loss had reduced their numbers to critically low levels. By 2017, the park supported over 1,500 black bears, creating frequent encounters between the animals and the thousands of visitors who flocked to the area each year. Ronald Malloy, known to his friends as Ronnie, had been turkey hunting in the area for over a decade. The 43-year-old machinist from Knoxville was part of a regular hunting group that made annual spring trips to the national forest lands surrounding the park. Malloy was considered something of a minimalist by his companions, preferring to travel light and rely on his truck for shelter rather than dealing with the complexity of tent camping. The evening of June 15, 2017, brought an unexpected weather change to the region. What had begun as a clear, warm day had deteriorated into a steady downpour that showed no signs of letting up. Malloy's hunting companions had traditionally established their camp, setting up tents and a communal cooking area about a quarter-mile from the gravel parking area where Malloy had positioned his truck. Malloy's Ford F-150 was equipped with a fiberglass camper shell that provided reasonable protection from the elements. He had installed a thin foam mattress in the truck bed, along with a sleeping bag and basic camping supplies. The setup was Spartan but functional, allowing him to stay dry and reasonably comfortable during inclement weather. His hunting gear, including a Remington 870 shotgun chambered for turkey loads, was secured in the truck's cab. The decision to sleep in the truck bed rather than join his companions at their tent camp proved to be both fortunate and terrifying. Malloy had properly secured his food supplies and trash in bear-proof containers, following park regulations and his own years of experience in bear country. However, he had overlooked one seemingly innocent detail: an apple-scented air freshener that hung from his truck's rearview mirror. The commercial air freshener had been in the truck for several months, its scent so familiar that Malloy no longer noticed it. However, the concentrated apple fragrance was apparently detectable to the sensitive noses of the local black bear population, particularly during the humid conditions created by the evening's rainstorm. Malloy was awakened around midnight by the sound of something large moving around his truck. His initial assumption was that one of his hunting companions had returned to the parking area for some forgotten piece of equipment. However, the sounds were wrong. Instead of footsteps on gravel, he heard the distinctive scraping of claws on metal and the creaking of the truck's suspension under unexpected weight. The realization that a bear was investigating his truck came when Malloy heard the unmistakable sound of plastic being torn and bent. The bear had apparently discovered the camper shell's rear window and was attempting to gain access to the truck bed. The animal's efforts were causing the entire vehicle to rock back and forth, creating a terrifying sensation for the trapped hunter. Malloy's response was hampered by the fact that his shotgun was secured in the truck's cab, accessible only through the rear window that was currently being attacked by the bear. His attempts to reach the weapon were complicated by the bear's continued efforts to break through the camper shell's rear access point. The animal seemed particularly focused on the area around the rear window, where the apple scent was presumably strongest. The hunter's situation became increasingly desperate as the bear's attacks intensified. The animal was using both claws and teeth to attack the aluminum framework of the camper shell, creating tears in the material that would eventually provide access to the truck bed. Malloy began banging on the inside of the camper shell with his flashlight, hoping to discourage the bear through noise and intimidation. When the noise-making proved ineffective, Malloy attempted to reach through the truck's rear window to access the horn button on the steering wheel. The awkward angle made this difficult, but he eventually managed to sound the horn in a series of short blasts. The sudden loud noise seemed to startle the bear temporarily, but it resumed its attack within minutes. The situation was resolved when one of Malloy's hunting companions, attracted by the horn blasts, arrived at the parking area and fired a warning shot into the air. The bear immediately fled into the forest, leaving behind a severely damaged camper shell and a badly shaken hunter. The aluminum framework was bent and torn, with several panels completely destroyed by the animal's claws and teeth. Malloy emerged from the truck bed to find that the bear had also damaged his truck's exterior, leaving claw marks on the paint and denting the tailgate. The apple-scented air freshener was gone, presumably consumed by the bear during its destructive exploration of the vehicle. The total damage was estimated at over $2,000, making it one of the most expensive encounters with wildlife in Malloy's hunting career. The experience had a profound impact on Malloy's approach to camping and hunting. He replaced the destroyed air freshener with a small wooden cross and never again slept in his truck bed while hunting in bear country. The incident also led to increased awareness among his hunting group about the importance of eliminating all scented items from their camping areas, regardless of how innocent they might seem. Malloy continued hunting in the Elkmire Highlands Preserve, but always from the safety of a properly constructed tent camp with his companions. He frequently related the story of his encounter with the black bear, emphasizing the animal's persistence and the destructive power of its claws and teeth. The damaged camper shell was eventually repaired, though Malloy kept photographs of the destruction as a reminder of how quickly a routine camping trip could turn dangerous in bear country. The Sawtooth Ridge formed a rugged spine along the Idaho-Montana border within the forest, their peaks and valleys creating some of the most challenging and rewarding hunting terrain in the northwestern United States. Towering granite ridges, dense evergreen thickets, and isolated meadows combined to produce a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. The region's elk population had recovered dramatically since the early 1900s, when unrestricted hunting had nearly eliminated the herds from their traditional ranges. By 2003, the area supported healthy populations of Roosevelt elk, drawing bow hunters from across the country who sought the ultimate challenge of harvesting these magnificent animals with primitive weapons. Brothers Robert and Kevin Mitchell had been planning their September elk hunt for over a year, coordinating vacation schedules and accumulating the specialized equipment required for success in the high country. Robert, the older brother at 34, was a mechanical engineer from Boise who had been bow hunting for nearly 15 years. His methodical nature and attention to detail made him a skilled outdoorsman. Kevin, 29, worked as a forest firefighter and brought considerable wilderness experience to their partnership. His instincts for reading terrain and spotting fresh sign made them an effective team. Both brothers carried compound bows manufactured by Matthews, precision instruments capable of delivering arrows with enough force to humanely harvest the largest North American game animals. Their equipment also included wind checker bottles filled with unscented powder, cow call reeds designed to mimic the vocalizations of female elk, and camouflage clothing that would allow them to blend seamlessly with the forest environment. They had even practiced scent control, washing with unscented soap and storing their gear in airtight containers layered with pine needles and earth. The hunting area they had selected was located deep in the Bitterroot Forest, accessible only by a strenuous 8-mile hike from the nearest logging access road. The terrain was characterized by steep ridges covered in dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, with occasional clearings that provided feeding areas for the elk herds. The air was crisp, and the forest silent save for the occasional crackle of a distant branch or the haunting bugle of a bull elk. The remoteness of the location virtually guaranteed that they would encounter no other hunters during their week-long expedition. The first indication that something was amiss came on their third day in the field. Robert had been glassing a distant slope through his binoculars when he spotted what appeared to be another hunter moving through the timber. The figure was wearing an elaborate ghillie suit, a type of camouflage clothing that used natural materials to break up the human silhouette. While such equipment was not uncommon among serious bow hunters, the suit worn by this individual was far more elaborate than anything the brothers had seen before. It blended so well with the forest floor that Robert nearly missed it on first glance. The mysterious figure was observed crawling across the forest floor in a manner that suggested either exceptional dedication to remaining concealed or possibly some form of physical impairment. The movement was slow and deliberate, with the individual remaining prone for extended periods before advancing in short, careful increments. The figure moved with practiced stealth, suggesting extensive experience in wilderness tracking and concealment techniques. Kevin attempted to make contact with the figure by using his elk call, producing a series of cow calls that should have been recognizable to any elk hunter. The mysterious individual showed no response to these vocalizations, continuing his slow progress across the slope without any acknowledgement of the brothers' presence. Similarly, attempts to attract attention through hand signals and other visual cues proved completely ineffective. The figure appeared either oblivious or deliberately unresponsive. Neither possibility was reassuring. The brothers' concern deepened when they encountered the same figure later that evening, positioned approximately 200 yards from their carefully selected tree stand. The individual was sitting in an unnaturally rigid position, apparently observing their hunting location with the same patience and intensity that the brothers brought to their own elk hunting. The figure's face was painted with what appeared to be charcoal or commercial face paint, applied so thoroughly that his features were completely obscured. The individual's behavior suggested someone with extensive military or law enforcement training, possibly conducting surveillance exercises in the area. The behavior exhibited by the mysterious figure was unlike anything the brothers had experienced during their years of hunting in various locations across the western United States. The individual remained motionless for hours at a time, never shifting position but occasionally making subtle adjustments that indicated alertness and purpose. Most unsettling was the figure's apparent lack of normal hunting equipment. No bow, rifle, or other hunting implements were visible despite the elaborate camouflage. The absence of traditional hunting gear suggested the person might be engaged in training exercises or research activities rather than hunting. The brothers' unease increased dramatically when they discovered that their equipment had been disturbed during the night. Items had been moved slightly from their original positions, changes that were subtle but unmistakable to experienced outdoorsmen who were accustomed to maintaining precise organization of their gear. A small bundle of paracord had been uncoiled and retied in an unfamiliar knot, and one of their food bags had been moved a few feet from its sealed container. More concerning was the discovery that their GPS unit had been tampered with, all of their saved waypoints deleted without explanation. The psychological impact of these discoveries was significant. The brothers had invested considerable time and effort in scouting their hunting area, carefully marking locations of elk sign, water sources, and travel routes. The loss of this navigational data represented not just an inconvenience, but a serious safety concern in terrain where a wrong turn could result in becoming lost in thousands of acres of wilderness. The methodical nature of the tampering suggested someone with technical knowledge and specific intent. The situation escalated when the brothers returned to their truck at the end of their planned hunt. Someone had used a sharp instrument, likely a hunting knife, to scratch a message into the paint of their vehicle's tailgate. The message read, "Elk aren't the only thing being hunted." The lettering was crude but clearly intentional, carved deep enough into the metal to be permanent. The message appeared to be a warning or intimidation tactic, possibly related to territorial disputes over hunting areas. The brothers' response to this discovery was swift and decisive. Rather than attempting to confront the mysterious figure or investigate further, they loaded their equipment and departed the area immediately. Their decision was influenced by several factors, including the remoteness of their location, the apparent mental instability of the individual they had encountered, and the implicit threat contained in the carved message. They did not speak much on the long drive home. Each was lost in his thoughts, processing the disturbing chain of events and the sense of vulnerability they had never before experienced in the wild. The incident was never reported to law enforcement authorities, partly because the brothers were uncertain about what crimes, if any, had been committed. The vandalism to their truck was relatively minor, and the disturbing of their equipment could not be definitively attributed to the mysterious figure. However, the psychological impact of the encounter was profound. Effectively ending their use of that particular hunting area, Robert and Kevin continued bow hunting in other locations, but never returned to the Sawtooth Ridge area of the forest. The experience had demonstrated that even in the most remote wilderness areas, hunters might encounter individuals whose motivations and mental state posed potential dangers. The brothers' story became a cautionary tale within their hunting circle, emphasizing the importance of maintaining situational awareness and trusting instincts when something felt wrong in the wilderness. What they had hoped would be a week of connection with nature, bonding, and adventure had instead turned into something else entirely, a lingering reminder that not every threat in the wilderness comes from the natural world, but sometimes from other people whose presence in remote areas may have purposes entirely different from recreation or hunting.